welcome to Podspective, an initiative by Daitwa Avyat. This podcast delves into the values carried by Daitwa, Governance Lab, Nepal Leadership Academy, and Nepal Rising, and discusses themes of governance, leadership, and innovation. This podcast aims to promote sustainable economic development of Nepal and evidence-based policymaking.
Sole, in the world of politics, where you spend a lot of time, we're seeing a major development, right? Mm-hmm. Particularly now in the US, right? So, I studied there. I lived there for 17 years, and we all look at US as sort of the epitome of gender equity, right? So this is where we have women in leadership making change happen, right? This is the picture. So it's not just about the numbers. It's really about, seeing, professors and, who are talking about gender equity, teaching equity, and politicians and all of this. But now we see a very different reality. To use the word women in a proposal or in teachings now is in question.
Yeah.
The word diversity, right? So fundamental to, the conversation we're having at this point, whether it's like, who you are or what you do, right? Is in question. So then like, I am quite, sort of like, I'm surprised, but also wondering how what to make of this, right? So what happened?
Yeah.
Right? And what does this mean, in terms of political culture, political institutions? What did I and many others, what did we not see?
Yeah.
And maybe what relevance is there of this for Nepal?
Yeah, it's such an important moment right now, Pukhar, in U.S. politics and in the world on issues of inclusion. The fact that in the last 2 months, the words diversity, equity, and inclusion have now become an anathema in the U.S. And how rapidly the approach towards inclusion can and has been eroded is, I think, quite astonishing and shocking. And I think there are a few things that I would say in response to this. One is something we've already talked about, that the importance of institutions that are hard to change. We don't have those institutions in the U.S.
You don't?
We don't have quotas. We're one of the few countries of the world that doesn't, at any level of politics. And so all of our affirmative action or inclusion policies are informal. And as a result of that, or they're formal, well, in fact, they're all informal, because there have even been Supreme Court rulings saying they're not allowed to be included. We're not allowed to even at this point in university admissions at every level, including graduate degrees, we're not allowed to know the race of a candidate, so that cannot be a factor in consideration. And so because these policies for inclusion were all informal, what we're seeing is how rapidly they can be eroded. And I think things would look very different if these institutions had been mandated. And I think that's where, so the first thing I would say is that's something that would look very different in a country like Nepal, where not only are there institutions, but those institutions were achieved through bipartisan agreement or, cross-partisan agreement through the country coming together and agreeing. That doesn't mean everyone agrees, but it means that this was stated as a fundamental tenet of what Nepal's democracy should look like, in a way that it is not part of the core of how we have articulated the fundamental core of the U.S. democracy. The second thing, though, that I would say is, myself included, not necessarily about the U.S., but other parts of the world, I think it's very easy to get into this belief that women's inclusion and inclusion more generally is much better elsewhere. In the US, we talk about Sweden as the prime example of perfect outcomes for women, where men take as much paternity leave as women take maternity leave, et cetera. And yet, and I think a lot of places see the US in this way. And I think the challenge here is that, as I've already mentioned, patriarchy exists everywhere. Its form looks different. And so it's easier when you look at a place like the US where women's labor force participation is higher. There's still gender wage gaps, but they're maybe a little smaller. We see women in positions of power. And so therefore, not the highest power, but we see that we have these stories and media narratives that really portray this. And yet I think on the ground, as I mentioned, even with our elections, the same issues are coming up. It's hard to get to global rates of violence against women, but it's not very different in the US versus in South Asia or other parts of the world. I just think some of these indicators are more hidden. And so I think the assumption that we've achieved inclusion or more progress on inclusion is itself a challenge because it makes us have a blind eye. And maybe an example of this can be brought in with just how we think about measurement. So when we think about measuring gender bias in a survey question, the sort of first level wave of gender bias measures ask explicitly, do you think men make better political leaders than women? Do you think men deserve jobs more than women? And so a lot of the reason that people assume there's stronger patriarchy in South Asia is because this is the region of the world where the answer to that question is the highest. So more than 50% of people across South Asia say that men make better political leaders than women, not even that they're equal. Whereas that's very low in the US. Though we can think about why that's low, and maybe it's not just reflecting true beliefs. But in the US, where are we at now? The question about gender bias is, do you even believe there is discrimination against women? With so many people now saying, no, there is no discrimination of women. And that is now evidence of gender bias, that you have willingly taken this blind eye to what clearly continues to perpetuate society. And so I think that blind eye at times inhibits some of the progress. And maybe to provide a few data points that might be surprising to people, just in terms of political inclusion, something that I teach in class is, there are only a handful, less than 5 countries in the world where women make up more than men in the national parliament, in the sort of major house of the national parliament. And the countries that people name are the US, Canada, Finland, Sweden, New Zealand, exactly, Norway. And none of those countries are there. In fact, in the US, it's, very low. I think it's around 25%, which is the global average. But they're all countries in the global south: Rwanda, Bolivia, Cuba, largely places that have institutionalized protections. And so none of this is my way of saying that things are better in the global south and the global north, or better in the global north and the global south, but that I think the way I see the world is that there are different forms of exclusion, different ways we talk about it, different ways it manifests, that can create these false narratives of things being better in one place. And to go back to your original question of where we're at in the US right now, I think it has been a case of, we've had a lot of progress, several steps forward. In the last 5-10 years, we saw the rise of the Me Too movement and the challenging of women being afraid in their workplace of harassment and women's right to equal pay. And those movements saw mass collective action of women on the streets. We also had the Black Lives Matter movement demanding racial equality and demanding a lack of coercion from the state for racial minorities and for Black people specifically. And that progress is now, being met with resistance. And, it's hard to attribute one to the other, but it's not surprising if we think about the trajectory of most places that when you take 2 steps forward, we often see a step backward. And it's easy to focus on that step backward, but also important to remember that it's a response often to many steps forward, and often founded in fear of what inclusion brings. And so maybe the actual last thing I'll say in this, and then maybe we can think about the larger implications of this for the world, but is the foundation of the challenges right now to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US are rooted in the belief that inclusion challenges meritocracy. It challenges fairness. And that by elevating, we even see this in the nomination proceedings of our current Secretary of Defense, saying that, women in the military were held to different standards, lower standards. And so I'm happy to have women so long as they meet the standards that men meet. This belief that inclusion comes with a lowering of standards. And yet we have very little evidence to support that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where research is really important. Is it's easy to throw out hypotheses, especially when they have political goals. But the value of my job is I get to seek truths. And, I did a recent study trying to evaluate exactly this question. The title of the paper is, Does Affirmative Action Worsen Quality? Theory and evidence to the contrary. What we find is the exact opposite is true, that we look at electoral quotas and the quality of politicians that come through, and this is in India, but we find that the women who are elected, the minorities who are elected are of higher quality, despite having worse opportunities than those who are elected without quotas in place. And more generally, there's a body of research from different parts of the world, including Sweden, that shows that the quotas that exist there led to men having to be held to higher standards because they now have to compete with the women who are of higher quality. And so inclusion doesn't just not challenge meritocracy, it affirms it. And it leads to better outcomes and better institutions for everyone.
This is interesting. My takeaway is, when these types of activities come, it may be cyclical in some ways, right? You make a lot of progress. It is going to disappoint some people. Some people will undergo losses, and so it's going to be met with resistance. But several steps forward, some steps backward. But that's an opportunity.
Exactly.
That is the opportunity to learn where we are and what needs to be done. Because maybe we didn't spend enough time. Right? And I think that is a very valuable way of thinking for Nepal as well. Because, we have the quota system and we're looking at, and in the recent election, we're looking at, okay, what happened in the local elections, right? Why are we taking steps backward? So maybe this is the opportunity for us to look at what happened. Why is it happening this way and what to do with it? Now, coming to Nepal, maybe if you can talk more about what you do here. You've been working here for now almost 5 years, no?
I started my first trip was 2016. So
2016.
almost a decade.
Almost a decade. That's wonderful. So, and Sole, it's really wonderful. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to collaborate, right? For so long. And a governance lab has been collaborating with Rohini, you, and the whole IEN family. Tell us a bit more about what you're doing in Nepal. What are the questions that are keeping you awake in the night?
So many things to say. I'm going to start by actually picking up on the point you made, which is I think you got into my head. I don't know how you read exactly how I see it, but but this one step back is such an opportunity, and an opportunity in particular for learning, which is exactly, I think, how I see some of my role, both in Nepal and in the world, because, especially when it comes to inclusion, gender inclusion, it's hard to understand when the forces keeping things unequal are so hidden. It's hard to see them until they're challenged. This is maybe going to get a little bit academic, but a challenge with studying agency and coercion is that successful coercion isn't observed. If you stop someone from doing something, well, they're just not going to do it because they know you're going to threaten them if they do it. And so it's only when things become a threat do you reveal the underlying coercive forces that exist. And that's what's happening in that step backwards is we're learning what was there all along, but invisible. And so when I think about what keeps me up at night, what we're doing here, it's trying to uncover the truths of what the remaining and lingering challenges are, and identify and study and work with organizations in Nepal to test and evaluate solutions to those problems and challenges. And so the work, when we started here, the work was thinking about the inclusion of ethnic minorities in Nepal's political spaces. We spent a lot of time thinking about the representation of Janjatis in politics, and how has the process of democratization, the process of writing a constitution for a group that actually doesn't have protections at the local level, how did the devolution of power to local governments change representation? And we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And what we observed in that, I'll speak briefly and happy to share more, but is that there has been major progress, that we see not perfect, but much higher representation of ethnic minorities, particularly Janjatis. I think there's still work when we think about Dalits and others from even more disadvantaged backgrounds, but in political spaces. And I think that is the way we see that research is it makes Nepal a beacon for the rest of the world. How do you get representation of a group without a quota? That's something that Nepal achieved in only, a couple of elections post constitution writing. But then what keeps me up now is, well, where is progress being met with resistance? And a big part of that answer is around gender inclusion. And so we've spent a few years thinking about and trying to understand, what does women's electoral representation in Nepal look like? What has the institutionalization of quotas meant for women's representation? And how is it changing? And you hinted at this in your response, but we see declines in women's representation between the 2017 and the 2022 elections.
Especially at the local level.
At the local level. This has come through in conversations that we have had with local level politicians, that they face hurdles to getting tickets. One of the things we've been trying to uncover is, what are the roots of those challenges? Is it resources like we talked about? Is it just money that would solve this? Is it voters not wanting this kind of leader? And so this is democracy functioning. That's not quite what we, we're still sorting it out, but that doesn't seem to be the answer. Or is it
the gatekeepers?
And so right now we're in this deep diagnosis, and I can talk about the ways that we study this, but a lot of what we do is a triangulation between collecting a lot of data so that we can make sure that what we're learning is not just unique to a particular part of Nepal or a particular set of interviews that we do, but something that is felt more broadly, but also pairing that with doing interviews and spending time on the ground and talking to people to understand what that lived experience is. The last time I was here and we had the chance to talk, I interviewed and spoke with dozens of female politicians at all levels, and learned about the struggles that they face that then informed our measures. And the last thing that I'll say is that we're starting now, as we've built out this understanding of the challenges, we're starting to imagine the solutions. And one of the things that we're excited about is thinking about the role, how can you build collective action among women politicians?
Right.
And this idea came from those conversations and interviews that I had last time I was here, where I met with several of the women politicians who are part of the the assembly, the Constituent Assembly writing the Constitution, where the women across parties formed a caucus.
Yeah.
And this caucus was so powerful that it became threatening and was then banned. And so it revealed that even when like all else is equal, we haven't changed resources, everyone has what you have, women found a way in that process to challenge the systems, to make demands, to fight for the kinds of policies that are unique and specific to women. A lot of what came up was around citizenship, around protection of women's rights and protection from violence and other things. And so now we're thinking about, well, that was something that was achieved at a national level. What does it look like at local levels to help enable women to achieve their goals as opposed to imposing goals on them? What kinds of structures and institutions can you put to provide women with collective resources that they can jointly strategize, come together and demand representation and reveal in the process their strength, their power, their capability? So we'll see how all of that goes. But I think there are some promising solutions that don't require huge investments of resources or that don't require fundamental structural change, though of course those things would also likely have an impact, but that can improve, that have the potential to achieve the goal of increasing women's representation, not just as deputy mayors, but as mayors in Nepal as well, where we see so few women holding this powerful position.
Yeah. So, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about, a lot of the times when we look at where women are and where women aren't, we then think about what do we need to do to enable women to traverse this journey, right?
Yeah.
But then in that process, we many a time miss what interventions do we need to do on others.
Yeah.
Right? The others that are a very important part of this process, right? Because possibly, the distribution of power in a very practical way is such that the other group, the others are also very important. So, when we just talked about, this sort of, some steps back that we saw in this recent election, right? 2017 to the recent election. How do we look at this, right? I mean, there are groups that saw we're going to lose if we don't collude.
Yeah.
And so then they found a way.
Yeah.
Right. So how do we manage those interest groups?
Yeah.
Right. How do we make them allies in the process?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
The way, as a political economist, when I think about what it means to be a political economist, what it means is that I see the world through the strategic incentives that people have.
Yeah.
And part of what you're talking about is that these parties, their goal is to win elections. And they saw a challenge to that, and they strategically responded to that incentive set. And so, we have to understand how you make allies of adversaries and to change outcomes. It requires starting from the point of understanding someone's incentives. You're not going to change that. You have to work within that or challenge the system as a whole. And, when we think about how quotas were achieved in a lot of places, it was because people aligned quotas with the strategic incentives of people in power. So what would that look like in Nepal? I think the first thing I would say is that it's not obvious. This is one of the things we're studying. It's not obvious that when you see parties forming coalitions so that they can win elections, that fielding only men is the way that you actually win that election. I think that's an assumption a lot of people have, but one not grounded in evidence. It assumes that voters don't want women politicians. And I think that's a pretty big assumption. So,
and you're also saying that that's probably not the case in Nepal.
It's hard to say definitively, but we have, and it's something that we literally today itself are launching a survey to try to assess. So I'll have an answer for you in a few months. But from what we have seen so far, when voters have the choice, they seem to choose women at the same rate as men. And we see this across the world, that when women run for office, they're often chosen at higher rates than men. And it's usually because people know that once a woman makes it on the ticket, she is of higher quality. She had to overcome more hurdles.
Yeah.
And I think, as I told you, I spent a few, I was interviewing voters in Nepal about this issue just 2 days ago. And I saw, well, there are definitely people who would align with this assumption. They believe, well, women may not have the same amount of time, or they may not have the same resources. What I saw more than anything was either people saying, I want women because I trust women to be more honest, more capable, to care about my interests, or others saying, my assumption about why women would be bad is not actually that women themselves, I wouldn't vote for them, but that women wouldn't have the same resources, they wouldn't have the same party support. So again, it takes you back a step of how are we creating conditions?
Yeah.
And so to me, the first step in building allies is disseminating knowledge around what it is that voters in Nepal actually want and what would win elections.
Yeah.
And maybe another piece of data on this is there have been several large-scale surveys that have shown that trust in women deputy mayors and the roles they've been assigned, particularly these adjudication responsibilities, is very high. And so there's
a lot of time.
There's a lot of understanding of the capability of women politicians. So to me, that's the first step in this, is saying, actually, we might not be at odds with each other. Your incentive of winning elections might actually be aligned with inclusion. And then we need to think about where maybe there are sticking points in that, and how do we fill those gaps? If it's simply that women don't have the resources to win a campaign, not that voters wouldn't want them to, that's a different thing than there's a fundamental belief that women are bad politicians, which is not what we're observing.
Building on that, there's a motion towards 33% women first past the post in Nepal. Yeah. So it's sort of an electoral reform that is being considered. Right. So instead of a complete quota system, we make sure that, women have the opportunity to, run for elections. And, there are many things that need to then happen. And that's also a result of some of these male politicians that I've heard talk about, well, if we want to go in the direction of political inclusion, we need to do some things correct by construction. Yeah. So if we did this, then every party by construction will then begin to work on building that force at the grassroots level. But then this is also not without challenges, right? Because then there are women, especially from marginalized groups, those that have less access to resources, that are saying, well, what would this mean in terms of intersectionality? Yeah. Of representation, right? Who are then going to make it to the top? Who women, right? So how do you look at a proposition like this? Is it too soon for Nepal to consider? How should we look at this situation?
Yeah, I think I have a few things to say, but I might not answer your question as explicitly because I wouldn't want to speak out of turn. But I think one of the things that you're articulating, there are a couple of really important components of this. The first is that let's imagine a world where it's hard to align the incentives of the gatekeepers with the outcomes we care about. what are alternative strategies? And some of those are to find people with more power who can then constrain the actions of the gatekeepers. And so thinking about additional reforms at the national level that change the incentive structures essentially for people, and how that can be a really powerful tool. And I think one that Nepal has built its democracy on, and where we see a lot of hope and potential for the future. And so I think these kinds of conversations are really important to be had about what kind of democracy does it look like. I think it's also important to note, it takes a long time to build stable institutions that solve all of the different challenges. And the fact that this is a conversation we're having today, I think is proof that Nepal is tackling these issues in a way, like with them at the forefront of the minds. The fact that it's not news, it's not new information that there has been a backsliding on quotas at the municipal level is proof that this is a part of conversation. And so, when I was saying before, lots of places have blind spots. I think one of the places that I have high hope for Nepal is that there isn't a blind spot. There is an awareness and then a question around this. That said, I think another part of what you said is when we think about institutional design, the question then becomes, what incentives do those new institutions create, and where do those incentives fail to achieve our goals? And so in this case, you might see an incentive to increase the representation of women, but at the cost of people who are doubly disadvantaged, marginalized women. And I think that's a challenge that we have observed across the world, that when you have only a quota for women, what you end up getting is elite women, women from sort of the least marginalized, most privileged social groups getting elected. And what are the costs of that for representation? I think without sort of knowing all of the options on the table in Nepal, I think the challenge is figuring out what are the available alternatives. How can it's so great that it's a part of the conversation, thinking about how do we protect the most marginalized, but also going back to the point about assuming that institutional protection isn't the silver bullet solution. Like, we need to think carefully about how we design those institutions, but then also how do we then work to erode the inequalities that lead to that, the challenge that's creating this conversation in the first place. And so simultaneously building ways to increase opportunities to sort of challenge these norms, challenge these structural conditions in the first place. So that doesn't leave, I think, with much by way of statement of where Nepal should or could go, but I think is simply a way of saying that that there's a lot. And one thing that I can speak on this, there's more work coming out of India right now, where there are quotas at the intersection of identities at a local level, which also exists in Nepal. Though in a slightly different way, quotas for leadership positions. And what that evidence is revealing is that you see even better outcomes, even more traction on social problems when you think about intersectionality in the design of institutions itself.
Well, this is wonderful. The point that you made earlier around inclusion being painted in a certain way, and evidence is suggesting otherwise, inclusion leading to better outcomes, right? So intersectionality being painted a certain way and actually leading to better outcomes. I think there is, so then that means that there is hope in that.
Yeah.
Right? There's hope in that. Nepal is moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
You've met Lakshmi Pandey,
yes,
right? And so she's a very energetic mayor, and to sort of agree with your point earlier, but based on my experience, I work a lot with local politicians, mayors, deputy mayors. And whenever I've worked with women mayors, women deputy mayors, one of the things I find is things happen.
Yeah.
Right? So if I have a conversation, that conversation is going to lead to something.
Yeah.
So I need to have less follow-up conversations before the results begin to show up, right? And so Lakshmi Pandey is one of those women. And now she has very proudly talked about 100 mayors.
100 mayors by 2027, yeah.
2027, right?
Yep.
And that's a wonderful aspiration. So whenever that gets announced, there's an uproar. But what does that mean in terms of the path to 100 mayors, right?
Yeah.
Now, from your experiences of working in Nepal and over the last almost a decade, looking at Nepal so closely, but also India and other places, if Lakshmi Pandey were here, what would you say to her in what we need to do or she needs to do? Because she's also the head of Narmen, head of rural municipalities of Nepal. What should that journey look like?
It's an easy question to answer because we're working with Lakshmi on what to do next.
Right person.
And I think, maybe before I talk about what I think is the right thing to do, one thing I want to say is that we've talked a lot about 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Progress begets resistance. But I think it's also important to note that progress begets progress. Inclusion begets inclusion too, in that there are these positive cascades that can happen. So if we get to 100 women mayors, even if we get to 50 women mayors, more than currently the 25, I think, that exist in Nepal, what will happen, what you can imagine might happen then is that, then the country is going to observe what you've observed in your conversations with mayors and deputy mayors. These women are capable. They're qualified. They're going to affect change. They're going to bring development to their communities. They're going to care about what their constituents want. They're going to be really good politicians. And that I think is a big part of the hurdle, is signaling to voters, signaling to parties, signaling to people who hold power over this, that this is not a bad thing, that once you have inclusion, in fact, everything gets better. And so part of, I think you rightly point out, the hurdle is getting to that point, because once you're there, it becomes easier. A piece of evidence to speak to this is that we looked at where Janjatis became mayors in 2017 to see how that led to their election in 2022. And what we found out is that that again, exactly this, inclusion begets inclusion. Where Janjatis were mayors, they were even more likely to become mayors in those same places than where historical upper, more privileged caste groups came in part because we saw that they delivered services better. Now, how do you get there, though? That's the challenge. Well, I can tell you what we're working with Lakshmi Pandey on with Narmen, and I've hinted at this already, but we're trying out. We've done a pilot already that proved really successful, but a program that's going to bring together existing women politicians, women deputy mayors, women ward chairs, and women politicians that didn't get elected, but who aspire for higher tickets, into regular convenings together across parties, coming once a month to have conversations that they lead. Because I think a big part of this is that often we don't know what they need. They know what they need better than we do. And instead of assuming a top-down, we can tell you what will make things better for you, instead we're thinking about how do we provide a structure, an institution that helps women advocate for their own needs. And the goal of this is that women who come together in these, what we're calling sort of political leadership networks, will have the capacity to share information with each other, share strategies, identify sort of common goals and common challenges, and then possible solutions for those, as well as serve as a signal. If you have 20, 30 women meeting in your district to think about how to improve politics and how to improve representation, it's hard to observe that and think, well, these women aren't good for the job, you know? So how can this be a first signal to party leaders, to voters, to constituents, that these women are dedicated, they're capable, they are ready for the fight. If they're ready to fight for the ticket, they're ready to fight for you as their voter and for you as their party. And so trying to think about an institutional solution that gives women power, and creates connections among women, because we've seen that collective action among women is where we get some of the most change in the world, but then also preemptively acts as a signaling device so that we can jumpstart what 100 mayors will then do for the future of inclusion in Nepal.
Yeah. And no, I love this term, signaling, right? And the good thing that I'm observing, Soleil, is in Nepal, whereas on the one hand, Lakshmi Pandey and a network of women politicians are working on something like this, there's also civil society that is also saying, well, if we don't now, we will miss the boat, or we might miss the boat, right? And so there's collective action that's happening. So because one of the very important things that I think happen in Nepal is the social mobilization. Right? Yeah. Because whereas a lot remains to be done around economic mobilizing in Nepal since mid 1900, like 1950s, one of the very big things that have happened is socio-political mobilizing, right? And so that energy, that knowledge, that network, right? They exist. And so I think I'm really excited to see and hopeful, because this and that, when come together with support of people like you, change, it's very likely, right?
I think this is exactly right. And I think what you're describing is the story of South Asia and South Asia's success. Yeah. One of the things that I have learned from working in South Asia and have brought into my own life as a value is the importance of collectives and community, and not necessarily just seeing yourself as an individual, but as a part of society and mobilizing accordingly. We see more of this collective action, particularly among women here. I'm going to sidetrack for a second, but I've spent a lot of time interviewing and engaging with and meeting with women's groups on the ground in Nepal and in India. And at the end of every interview, I like to end with, what questions do you have for me? So that it's not just me extracting. And without fail, I typically get two types of questions. One is usually about agriculture, which I know nothing about. But the other is like, what is your women's group? What does your group look like? And that kind of structure doesn't exist in my world, certainly without formalization. And so to me, what I like, one of the messages that I hope the world takes away from the fight for inclusion in South Asia, in Nepal, specifically, is the importance of seeing yourself as a part of a larger whole and fighting and socially mobilizing together. And I think in fact, it's such an important point that one of the things we've seen is that even without economic empowerment and economic mobilization, we've seen dramatic changes because of social mobilization. And so that suggests that instead of taking an eye towards what has worked in the West, but thinking about what is really working well here and what are the advantages that South Asia has for the world and for itself, I think is really important, and what leaves me optimistic about Lakshmi Pandey's goals.
No, as you're thinking about this community idea, I was remembering my wife because she sometimes says something which is really profound to me, right? She says, this is not just about me.
Yeah.
What I'm doing and why I am doing this is not just about me. This fight is not just about me. And it's not just about our daughters.
Yeah.
Right? We have 2 daughters. But it's about the many women that have done so much so that I can do what I am doing now.
Yeah.
So I can't... I have to be faithful to this journey. So which then talks about this whole idea of community, right? Because maybe she hasn't met all of them, but that 7 decades of action and agents and community, right? That's very important. Before we move into the last leg of our conversation, you also said progress begets progress, right? And so I was thinking about, when we look at the election, 2022 election, we talk about, steps back, but then there is also from 17, we went to 25.
Yeah.
Right? 17 to 25 is numerically, it's almost 50%.
Exactly.
So what does that say? Is this just, it just sort of happened, randomly? Or do you think there is something changing? Because position of a mayor to go from 17 to 25 seems like something is happening.
Yeah, without knowledge of those 8 additional cases or the 25, I'm certain that it was hard fought.
Yeah.
That those were battles waged, and those were convincing and compelling cases where progress was made. And I think that suggests that it's easy to also lose progress amidst resistance. That small changes move forward. There's something you said earlier that I really want to reemphasize here, that there's a fear that if we don't capitalize on the moment, that we'll stagnate, that Nepal will have an equilibrium that doesn't get to the North Star, the goal of inclusion. And I think the fact that that's a concept, that that's what's on the table right now, is proof that progress is still happening, that part of the progress is even acknowledging that the decline in women's representation as deputy mayors is a challenge and a problem. And so to me, I think the worst outcome right now would be for there to be hopelessness, because I think there are lots of bright spots where hope exists, and no battle for inclusion is going to be easy. I hope that is part of the takeaway. There isn't a silver bullet, but it doesn't mean that it's not being waged and that there aren't successful, for every unsuccessful battle, there's also successful ones happening. So I think I'm really glad that you reemphasized that it's easy to focus on where challenges remain, and hard to remember that there is movement happening forward. The fact that we're having this conversation is evidence of that.
We have little time at this point, but I did want to not end this without having talked about research.
Yeah.
Right. So conducting rigorous research in Nepal.
Yeah.
To a lot of researchers around the world, or people that want to do research in Nepal, they're oftentimes, Nepal, great, place, love the place, but, conducting research is difficult, and thus maybe some other place, right? So that's a narrative that we often hear about, but you guys have been, doing this day in, day out. You're building a whole, a battalion of young researchers in Nepal. So tell us more about your experience conducting research in Nepal. What is working, and what more remains to be done?
Yeah. It's been, as I said, about a decade. And I think this is another place where we've seen a lot of growth and progress, thanks to GovLab, thanks to lots of other organizations. And I want to really put emphasis on the role that Rohini has played in sort of building an institution and investing in people. And, there are things that I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of the fact that we now that we've placed several of the researchers that we've had, many of them now pursuing PhDs or graduate degrees at institutions of their choosing across the world.
World-class institutions.
Yes, exactly. And, even one of the very first RAs we had here who went and did a degree at Yale and is now back sort of helping really spearhead the organization, I think is proof of what the goal of this is, investing in local researchers, in local in people from Nepal, because, when there's with the challenge you started with, people not seeing Nepal as a fruitful place to study, well, the easiest way to solve that is to make sure that Nepalis have the ability to engage in that research. Though I also hope my vision for the world is that I hope Nepali researchers can study whatever they want. I'd love for them to come tell me how the US should function better. But, taking a step back and thinking about research here, because really what I would hope people would take away is how positive and fruitful an experience it has been, not just as an enterprise, but also in terms of what we can learn. And so I'll say a little bit about the kind of research we do, and why maybe that is particularly seen as particularly challenging, which is that the sort of core of our work is thinking about how do you build rigorous, very wide-scale, data-based evidence around what works and what doesn't.
Yes.
And that means, we've run surveys with thousands of people, politicians, citizens, et cetera. We've collected just a ton of data on this, existing data from various actors in the government.
Yeah. And this new research is across all 753 municipalities, no? The Women Network?
It is. We are likely to do networks across half of Nepal.
Yeah. Wow.
And this will be using a methodology called a randomized control trial, so that then, we can know exactly whether this works or doesn't work, and if it works, how and why, and if it doesn't work, how and why. And that kind of research is hard generally. It requires a lot of infrastructure. It requires a commitment to long-term evidence building, which can be challenging, both because, you're in it for a decade before you start to see the fruits of the labor, but also I think an opportunity. We could not do the work that we do without the help of so many local researchers. It is, and both because I think the answers we'd be reaching, the things we'd be learning would be inaccurate without sort of deep contextual knowledge, but also because research requires machinery. It's not something that is just done. You can't get to these truths. And so I would say, what I will say now that I've talked about what we do is why and how it has been fruitful. There has been a thirst in Nepal for research in a way I haven't observed elsewhere. I see that a lot from young people.
Good.
It has been the ability to find people who want to work in research has been so much easier than in other places that I have worked. The desire to sort of make a path
One
forward.
of our RAs is working in India, right?
Yes, exactly.
Satish.
Exactly. And that is, I think, first, a statement to researchers out there that there is demand to support this endeavor, and that makes it easier when you have a good team, good people that you get to work with. But also, I think there's a lot of different international voices in Nepal that bring research and evidence of different types. And I think, part of the hurdle is recognizing the long time horizons and what can be learned from this rigorous evidence. But I think that's part of what we're committed to doing is thinking about how do we build a coalition of policymakers too, who want to use this evidence in a way that will effectuate change. That's some of the goals of one of the core missions of Inclusion Economics Nepal, and is thinking about how can research be valuable, not just producing knowledge for knowledge's sake. And so something that we've been working towards and that I'm really hopeful about. And the very last thing I will say is that, as someone who spent a lot of time studying India, a lot of the world will say, okay, with a population of 1.4 billion people, of course we need to know how India works. And I can imagine that some of what you said, the challenge of people saying it's hard to do research in Nepal, it's hard to capture data, there's not, one of the things that I have been so impressed with is it has been easier to learn things. There is an acceptance of creating knowledge. When I go to the field talking to people, I had an interview on Monday with a woman where we were asking her about her demands over governance, her engagement. At the end of the interview, she said, no one has asked me for my opinions on this. I'm so glad that we got to share, that I can just share with you what I've learned. And that has meant that I think we're learning things.
Yeah.
In Nepal is in a moment of experimentation. And so why not bring experimenters in to study what that looks like? And I say all of that to say, I think there's just an incredible opportunity to learn things about what policies and things might work in Nepal, but also to learn what will work for the world so that Nepal's evidence, Nepal's knowledge can then shape these broader global discussions.
Yeah. What I also find very promising in the way IEN is operating is not just bringing rigor and local researchers in the process and international knowledge, but also thinking about what this means for Nepal, what this means for building institutions in Nepal, how does this connect with policy makers in Nepal, and how do you, and knowing that we're not there yet and there are gaps, how do we empathetically go through this journey, right? Because I'm sure, as you try to take the evidence to policymakers, that is also not an easy journey.
Though I would have to say, I think it's not an easy journey anywhere.
Yeah.
And it is not an easy journey.
Yeah.
But one of the things, I remember one of my earlier visits in Nepal, like if I wanted to talk to a policymaker in the US, it would be near impossible to get their time. And, one of the first times I was here, I was able to get meetings with people in some of the highest positions. And so that doesn't mean that the acceptance of research and the evidence that we're building is just going to be immediate.
Yes.
That's going to take time, but maybe to couch it in the language we've used, it's easier to get a seat at the table, and now it's our job to fight for voice in that process. And so we've made a step forward, and now, as we learn things that are valuable, I suspect it will be possible to convince people that this is worth investing in.
No, totally. I definitely think so. As an organization that is committed to working with the government on, institutionalizing change in turning these pilots into large-scale change efforts, I have realized that, it's not easy. It's not easy, but this is the only way, things will scale and create lasting impact. And the government is willing to come to the conversations. One of the challenges that we're, I think, facing now, not just us, but many others, is the access to administrative data, right? That the government has. And perhaps, how the government thinks about sharing data and the use of data. But those are places where, at least we're beginning to have the conversations.
Yeah.
And we can go in that journey. So I'm very happy that, we're working with an institution like IEN that has done that in India, and we are on this leg in Nepal.
And what I would say just to that is that, that the amount of data that the government has creates an incredible potential for learnings. And so as those conversations are navigated, and of course, they should include discussions of how that data is protected, how it's ensured so that it doesn't hurt or harm anyone in Nepal. So those are important conversations to have. But as they're navigated and that data is opened up for researchers to study, without having to go and collect data, there's so much that can be learned about what is and isn't working in Nepal.
Great. So, we've covered a lot. We've talked a lot. But towards the end, Sole, we began with your story of the boat, right?
Yes.
And thank you for sharing that. And just the same way, your journey hasn't been easy to start from where you were to where you are at now. Nepal is also undergoing, not an easy journey, right? Political inclusion. This whole constitution and inclusion being enshrined to where we are now at.
Yeah.
A lot of challenges. There are a lot of challenges. But this all said, where do you see hope? Where do you see hope? You've engaged in Nepal for the last decade. So in terms of politics or research or anything else, where are you seeing hope?
I think hope for me has come up at so many points in our conversation today. And I hope that in some ways that's a core part of this message, but maybe where I would summarize it is that in this conversation, in the conversations that I've had, what I see in Nepal is the opposite of a complacency. It is drive, motivation, openness to reevaluation.
Yeah.
And to me, that creates hope for change to come through. And I think a lot of that is rooted in what I said, not having blind spots, but seeing things. It doesn't mean it will be easy. If political inclusion or anything about politics was easy, then, we wouldn't be where we are now, in much of the world. But I think by shining lights on these, by having conversations like the one we're having now, by people engaging with these issues, by people being willing to question and try to seek truths, which is, what brought me to this endeavor. I think there's an incredible amount of hope. And I think it's when we stop questioning things and just, either grow hopeless or just take what's being done as a given. That to me is where things become stagnant and challenging. And so to me, that's the opposite of what my almost a decade of experience in Nepal has shown me, that complacency doesn't exist.
Love it. This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Sole, for your time, for the ideas, and for our collaboration. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.